For an entire week, Guardsman Thomas Hale couldn't get a single drill right. His marching was out of step. His rifle work lagged behind the rest. In the mock security exercises, he was always just slow enough to fail. By the 5th day, his own squad had started calling him the tourist. Everyone knew he was finished. One more bad run, and he'd be off the readiness roster for good. But on the final afternoon, the commander stepped onto the line. He didn't lecture, he didn't shout. He just gave Hale a single short order. 2 words that turned the worst performer in the program into someone no one would ever underestimate again. Before I show you exactly what happened on that parade ground, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon pressed, because you won't believe how quickly those 2 words changed everything. The first light of day spilled over Wellington Barracks, catching on polished brass buttons and gleaming bayonets. The parade ground reflected the pale sky in rippling puddles, washed down before dawn for the elite internal readiness program. A week where ceremonial guards discovered that looking impressive was just the beginning. Guardsman Thomas Hale moved with the line, his tall frame upright, bearskin hat perfectly aligned. From 20 feet away, he looked every inch the part, until you listened to his boots against stone. His left foot came down just a fraction too late. Half a heartbeat, maybe less, but enough to throw the cadence off by that single jarring beat that made the man beside him adjust his stride. The ripple passed down the line like a crack spreading through a perfect wall. The rifle drill came next, movements snapping through the morning air with mechanical precision. 24 men breathing as one, rifles rising and falling in perfect synchronization. Hale's came half a breath behind. Not wrong, but slow enough that his neighbours were already locked in position before his found its mark. It wasn't obvious to the tourists peering through the railings, but to anyone in uniform, it was glaring. The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he made a mark in his notebook. Then came the mock intruder drill. The call rang out sharp across the yard, and 23 guards turned in unison toward the threat, a palace constable playing an aggressive trespasser. 23 rifles swung into ready position with clockwork precision. Hale's movement lacked that crucial edge of urgency. In his hesitation, the intruder had already crossed the chalked perimeter before being tackled by another guard. The exercise whistle blew, sharp and disapproving. Along the edge of the yard, 3 guards in the reserve group had been watching. Corporal Ryan Fletcher folded his arms, smirking. "Bit slow there, wasn't he?" Guardsman Lucas Trent chuckled. "Maybe the old boy needs a sat-nav to keep in step." Alfie Dre grinned with an edge sharp enough to cut. "Marching's not so easy when you're due for your pension." The words threaded through the air with particular cruelty. If they stung, Hale didn't show it. His eyes stayed forward, expression fixed in blank professionalism. Most of the watching NCOs focused on the formation as a whole, noting flaws for the morning report. Only one man's gaze was fixed entirely on Hale, Commander Richard Mason, standing at the far edge, with hands clasped behind his back, silver braid catching the light. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes followed Hale's every movement, as if measuring something no one else could see. 5 days earlier, rain had been falling in thin sheets when Hale first stepped through the barracks gate for the readiness program. He didn't look like someone chosen for elite training. Late 30s, carrying that faint stiffness in his left knee from an old injury. His uniform was immaculate, but there was nothing flashy about him. The duty clerk stamped his papers without looking up. "Second floor, room 12, briefing at 0800. Be early, sergeants here don't like surprises." His room was small, narrow cot, footlocker, wardrobe just big enough for 2 uniforms. That evening in the mess, most guards gathered in clusters, trading jokes and testing each other's drill manual knowledge. Hale chose a table near the wall where he could see the entrance, eating methodically while scanning the room. The first remarks came quickly. Fletcher leaned toward Trent, voice pitched to be overheard. "Good on parade, I'll give him that. But drills? Different league." "Might be here for nostalgia," Trent grinned. "Bit of old guard spirit before retirement." Dre smirked. "Just hope he can keep up when it counts." Hale ignored it all, finishing his meal and leaving without acknowledgement. Over the next days, small details stood out to anyone paying attention. which almost no one was. How Hale checked his rifle weight before every session. How he positioned himself in hallways with clear lines of sight. How he adjusted his bearskin twice before each drill. From his office window, Commander Mason noticed these habits. He'd been in the job long enough to recognize the difference between ceremonial precision and operational awareness. The first full day began with morning inspection. Hale's posture was textbook, equipment spotless, until the drill started. The timed march around the square tested precision and stamina. 48 boots struck stone in perfect cadence except for Hale's. His left foot fell behind, creating a jarring counter-rhythm. "Keep the pace, Hale!" the sergeant barked. "Yes, Sergeant," Hale replied, correcting briefly before slipping again. The rifle presentation drill exposed another flaw. "Present! Arms!" 24 rifles snapped up in unison. Hale's came a hair too slow, breaking the visual unity. By midday, the crowd breach simulation proved decisive. When the whistle blew, most guards surged forward, forming an impenetrable barrier. Hale hesitated, half a second at most, allowing the intruder to slip through. The whistle blew again, shrill and final. Fletcher smirked at Trent. "Textbook. The man's a step behind in every sense." "The tourist strikes again," Trent replied. "Old man's just sightseeing," Dre added. The nicknames stuck, spreading through the ranks like whispered verdicts. The tourist and old man became background noise during breaks. Hale ignored it all, checking his rifle in silence during pauses, standing apart from the chatter. By the third day, even quieter guards were believing the talk. "Nice bloke, but he's slowing us down," one muttered. From his observation point, Mason watched it all unfold. While others saw failure, he saw how Hale's rifle grip was always correct, how his eyes tracked the drill yard's edges, how he knew everyone's position without looking. But Mason kept those observations to himself. By the end of the week, the readiness program had done what it was designed to do: separated the wheat from the chaff, sharpened the edges of those who remained, and identified the weak links before they could compromise operational effectiveness. The final evaluation loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, a multi-stage drill designed to simulate real ceremonial duty under the kind of sudden high-pressure threats that could turn a routine posting into a career-defining moment. Everyone knew the stakes. Pass, and you secured a place in the elite readiness rotation, the kind of assignment that marked you as someone the palace could trust with its most demanding duties. Fail, and you'd be quietly reassigned to less challenging work, gate duty perhaps, or ceremonial postings where the only requirement was looking impressive for the cameras. For guardsman Thomas Hale, failure had become less a possibility than an accepted inevitability. The whispers from earlier in the week had hardened into quiet certainty among the ranks, the kind of group consensus that forms when everyone agrees on something without having to discuss it explicitly. The tourist, old man. Good enough for parade, useless when things get serious. The nicknames came now with less humour and more dismissal, as though everyone had agreed on the verdict before the test was even run. The morning's exercise was a compound scenario that would test every skill they had been developing all week. 5 stages spread across the barracks and parade ground, each one building on the last, each one demanding a different kind of excellence. First, a timed march with flawless cadence, the kind of precision that looked effortless, but required every man to suppress his individual rhythm in service of the collective beat. Then rifle drill under the kind of intense scrutiny that could spot a tremor in a man's hands from 50 yards away. After that, a sudden shift to a mock intrusion scenario where ceremony would have to give way to immediate, decisive action. The fourth stage would test armed response protocols, the kind of split-second decision-making that separated competent guards from exceptional ones. Finally, a precision ceremonial inspection to finish, proving that even after the chaos of emergency response, they could return instantly to the perfect bearing that their position demanded. Each segment would be scored separately, with deductions for hesitation, missteps, protocol breaches, or any of the dozen other ways a man could fall short of the standard. The final score would determine not just placement in the readiness roster, but reputation among peers and superiors for years to come. Hale started the day assigned to the second squad, alongside Corporal Ryan Fletcher and Guardsman Lucas Trent and Alfie Dre, the same men who had been providing commentary on his performance all week. From the opening march, the familiar pattern reasserted itself. His stride was just a shade off the collective rhythm, creating that subtle disruption in the sound of their boots against stone that was becoming his signature. It was enough to earn another mark in the sergeant's notebook, another black mark against his final score. In the rifle drill, his presentation was clean and technically correct, every movement executed with the precision of someone who had been handling weapons longer than some of his squad mates had been alive. But it came half a breath behind the others, just fractionally late enough to break the visual unity that made ceremonial drill something approaching art. By the third stage, the mock intrusion that had been his downfall in every previous attempt, the writing was on the wall. Hale's delayed step into the barrier line left a hole that the intruder exploited with theatrical efficiency, forcing Trent to overcompensate and destroying the formation's integrity. The whistle blew, and Fletcher's patience finally snapped completely. He turned his head, voice pitched to carry maximum impact, while staying just below the threshold of insubordination. "You're dead weight, Hale. Might as well wave them through next time. Save us all the embarrassment." The remark was loud enough to reach the watching NCOs and the cluster of palace officials who had gathered to observe the day's evaluations, but calculated to sound like legitimate tactical criticism rather than personal attack. Trent and Dre exchanged smirks that spoke of shared understanding, their eyes already sliding toward the small group of visitors who had come to see how the Guards' elite training programs actually worked. The fourth stage, the armed response simulation, went even worse. The scenario involved multiple hostiles advancing toward the mock palace gate from different angles, testing the Guards' ability to coordinate their response while maintaining both tactical effectiveness and ceremonial dignity. Hale was assigned a specific sector to defend, but his reaction came late and uncertain. By the time he moved to intercept his target, Fletcher had already stepped into the gap with the kind of decisive action that marked natural leadership. The rest of the squad surged forward in support, leaving Hale a half-beat behind, always reacting rather than anticipating. From his position at the edge of the parade ground, Commander Richard Mason watched the entire sequence unfold with the same impassive expression he had worn all week. His eyes tracked every delay, every hesitation, every ripple of frustration from Hale's squad mates as they worked around his limitations. Around him, the murmur of conversation from the other observers carried the inevitable verdict. Hale was finished, his place in the program about to become a cautionary tale about the importance of keeping up with the demands of modern service. The final stage was scheduled for the afternoon, after a brief break that would give the squads time to clean their kit and prepare for the concluding exercise. The air was thick with speculation about who would make the final readiness list, which names would appear on the roster that determined assignments for the next 6 months. Hale sat on the low stone wall by the drill yard, methodically cleaning his rifle with the kind of careful attention that spoke of long practice, paying no apparent mind to the sideways glances and whispered conversations happening around him. In the mess, Fletcher's voice carried over the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversations, pitched just loud enough to be heard at the neighbouring tables. "Last run this afternoon. Think old man's got one more fumble in him before they ship him back to gate duty." Trent chuckled, spooning sugar into his tea with unnecessary vigour. "One more? Try 3. I'll be surprised if he even makes it to the end without tripping over his own feet." Dre grinned over his mug, steam rising from the dark liquid like incense. "Place your bets now, lads. Afternoon's going to be quite the show." By the time they finished their meal, word had spread well beyond the Guards actually participating in the program. Several junior staff members from the palace offices had found excuses to linger by the parade ground railings, and more than a few senior NCOs, who normally wouldn't waste time watching routine evaluations, had positioned themselves where they could observe the afternoon's exercises. The final run always drew some interest. It was the culmination of a week's worth of intensive training after all. But today there was an additional element of anticipated spectacle. Everyone wanted to see how badly a guardsman could fail in front of an audience. When Hale stepped back into formation for the final exercise, the low winter sun was slanting across the yard at an angle that cast long shadows on the ancient stone. His face was as unreadable as ever, his movements calm and measured, as though nothing more significant than routine drill hung in the balance. But Commander Mason, still maintaining his position at the far edge of the observation area, had the distinct sense that the next hour would decide far more than just a place on a readiness roster. The squads were already moving into position for the final exercise when Commander Richard Mason left his customary place at the edge of the yard. His boots clicked against the stone with measured precision as he crossed the parade ground, each step deliberate and unhurried, but carrying an unmistakable sense of purpose. The sound drew curious glances from the guards in formation and raised eyebrows from the supervising NCOs, because Mason's role had been strictly observational up to this point. By the time he reached the supervising sergeant, conversations in the nearest ranks had gone quiet. There was something in Mason's bearing, not urgency exactly, but a focused intensity that suggested this wasn't a casual stroll across the yard. "Sergeant," Mason said, his voice level and conversational but carrying easily in the crisp afternoon air, "I'll be standing on the line for this one." The sergeant blinked, clearly caught off guard. Protocol was protocol, and observers observed from designated areas for good reason. "Sir, we don't normally—" "I'm aware of the standard procedure," Mason cut in, his tone remaining pleasant, but taking on an edge that suggested the discussion was already over. "I'll stand well clear of the formation, no interference with the exercise, unless circumstances require it." There was a pause, a small internal battle visible in the sergeant's eyes, as he weighed regulation against the reality of Mason's rank and position. The silver braid on Mason's cap and the weight of his authority in palace security matters ended the debate before it really began. "Yes, sir." Hale's squad was already at their starting position for the final palace security breach simulation. The scenario was designed to be the most demanding of the week, an armed intruder threat against the palace gates, requiring immediate response. Guards would need to intercept, disarm, and secure multiple targets while maintaining the kind of ceremonial discipline that had to look effortless even under extreme pressure. It was the kind of high-stakes, fast-moving drill that could make or break a career. And in Hale's current form, everyone watching assumed it would finish him completely. From his position in the formation, Hale saw Mason move onto the line in his peripheral vision. The commander's presence there was unusual enough to draw Fletcher's attention as well. The corporal muttered something under his breath to Trent that earned a quiet snicker and a shared look of anticipation. The starting whistle shrilled across the yard, sharp and urgent, and the squad moved into action. Fletcher and Trent surged forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that marked natural soldiers, intercepting the first wave of intruders with textbook precision that would have earned praise from any instructor. Hale took his assigned position, weapon angled in the regulation-ready hold, eyes scanning his designated sector with what looked like the same careful hesitation that had marked his performance all week. Mason waited. He didn't shout, didn't gesture, didn't give any obvious sign of what he was thinking. He simply followed Hale's movements with the focused attention of someone waiting for exactly the right moment to act. The second wave of intruders appeared at the far end of the drill area, advancing fast toward their objectives with the kind of controlled aggression that made these exercises feel almost real. Hale's reaction was steady but cautious, measured rather than explosive, maintaining that fraction of a second gap between stimulus and response that had become his trademark. Fletcher, seeing the familiar hesitation, started to bark over his shoulder with the exasperated tone of someone who had run out of patience. "Come on, Hale, move!" And that's when Mason stepped forward, his voice cutting across the yard with the clarity and authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Greywatch, now!" 2 words, nothing more, spoken with the kind of casual certainty that suggested they had been waiting to be said all week. The change in Hale was instant and electric, His shoulders squared, his weapon came up with fluid precision that made his previous movements look like amateur theatrics, and he moved, not rushed, not frantic, but with a pace and certainty that turned heads across the entire yard. He bypassed Fletcher in 3 flowing strides, intercepting an intruder before the man could even begin to raise his training weapon. A precise pivot, a disarm that looked almost casual in its efficiency, and the attacker was neutralized on the ground, weapon kicked clear and threat eliminated. The rest of the squad scrambled to keep up with what was happening. Hale flowed from target to target, like water finding its natural course, predicting angles of attack before they developed, placing himself exactly where he needed to be a half second before anyone else even realized the gap existed. His ceremonial rifle, normally nothing more than an impressive prop for parade duties, became something else entirely in his hands, hooking an arm here, blocking a strike there, turning each engagement into a controlled, efficient demonstration of exactly how much force was needed and not one bit more. The watching dignitaries along the railings murmured among themselves, leaning forward to get a better view of what was unfolding. The palace staff, who had come to witness what they thought would be a routine failure, found themselves watching something else entirely. Even the supervising sergeant forgot to write anything down for a moment, his pen hovering uselessly over the clipboard as he tried to process what he was seeing. In less than half the time normally allotted for the exercise, the last intruder was secured and the threat eliminated. Hale's breathing was steady, his posture returning immediately to the regulation bearing that marked a professional soldier at rest. He stepped back into his assigned position as though nothing unusual had happened, rifle held exactly as the manual dictated, expression as neutral as ever. The whistle blew long and low, signalling completion. The electronic timer showed a course record, not just for the day, but for the entire program's history. Fletcher stood a pace away, his helmet slightly askew, chest heaving from exertion that suddenly seemed inadequate compared to what he had just witnessed. He stared at Hale like he'd never seen him before, like he was trying to reconcile the man who had been stumbling through drills all week with the professional who had just made the rest of them look like enthusiastic amateurs. Trent and Dre stood in silence, their earlier smirks replaced by expressions of genuine confusion and something that might have been respect. On the far side of the yard, Commander Mason simply nodded once, as if confirming something he had known all along. The test was over, and the results had been exactly what he had expected. The yard remained unusually quiet as the squad filed back toward the equipment racks, the normal post-drill chatter conspicuously absent. Even the junior palace staff, who had been leaning over the railings moments earlier, seemed unsure whether applause was appropriate or if they had just witnessed something that demanded more serious consideration. Hale moved with the same unhurried precision he had shown all week, unstrapping his bearskin and setting it carefully on the bench, the white plume brushing lightly against his sleeve as he arranged his kit with methodical attention to detail. If he felt the weight of all the stares directed his way, if he noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere around him, his expression gave no indication of it. Corporal Fletcher lingered a step behind, his eyes fixed on Hale with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had just revealed itself to be far more complex than originally assumed. Finally, he found his voice, though it came out rougher than he had intended. "What the hell was that supposed to be?" Hale glanced over, his expression remaining as neutral as it had been all week. There was mood triumph in his face, no hint of satisfaction at having proven his critics wrong. "Drill's finished, Corporal." It wasn't dismissive, just final, the kind of statement that closed a conversation rather than opening it. Commander Mason was already moving toward them, his conversation with the supervising sergeant brief but intense. After a moment, Mason looked directly at Hale and gave a short, businesslike nod. "With me." They crossed the yard to one of the smaller briefing rooms on the ground floor, a narrow space with whitewashed walls that had seen decades of similar conversations, a polished wooden table scarred by countless meetings and the faint smell of saddle soap and institutional coffee that seemed to permeate every corner of military buildings. The door clicked shut behind them with finality, muting the sounds of the yard and creating the kind of privacy that suggested this conversation would never appear in any official record. The supervising sergeant lingered in the doorway, clearly reluctant to leave without understanding what had just happened, but Mason gestured toward the corridor with the polite firmness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'll handle the debrief from here." When they were alone, Mason leaned back against the table, studying Hale with the same focused attention he had been applying all week, but now with the satisfaction of someone whose theory had just been proven correct. "How long were you planning to keep up that performance?" Hale met his gaze without hesitation, his voice carrying the same steady professionalism it always had. "As long as necessary." "2 words," Mason said, more to himself than to Hale, a note of professional appreciation creeping into his tone. "That's all it took to flip the switch." He pushed away from the table, beginning to pace in the small space. "The rest of them think you've been fumbling drills all week because you've lost a step, gone soft with age. I know better." That was operational discipline. Hale remained silent, but something in his posture suggested he was listening with more attention than his neutral expression indicated. "I served with Greywatch operatives before," Mason continued, using the casual tone of someone stating an obvious fact. "Not officially, of course. Nothing about that unit appears in any records the public will ever see. But I know the conditioning when I see it. Operatives trained to blend in, to appear unremarkable, to hold back their full capability until they receive specific authorization. You hear the correct clearance phrase and everything changes." For the first time all week, Hale's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to suggest that Mason had struck closer to home than casual conversation. "The work back then wasn't like this," he said after a moment. "We operated in civilian clothes, in crowds, and at public events. Our job was to be invisible until we weren't. If you acted without proper authorization, you risked everything. Your cover, your principal, the entire operation. So you learned to wait, even when every instinct you'd ever developed told you to move." Mason nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with satisfying precision. Greywatch were the invisible shield behind the ceremonial sword. Most people don't know units like that exist. You're there in the palace forecourts during state visits, hidden among the ceremony and pageantry. You're there in the crowd at Trooping the Colour, or scattered through the spectators during a royal walkabout. But you're never on any official roster, never in any photographs that make it to the papers, and your service record certainly doesn't admit you were there. "The file says household division, standard ceremonial posting," Hale said evenly. "And that's all it needs to say." Mason studied him for another moment, recognizing the careful balance between truth and operational security that marked professionals who had worked in the shadows. "You realize those men out there will never look at you quite the same way again." Hale gave the faintest shrug, the gesture suggesting that the opinions of his squadmates had never been his primary concern. "Doesn't matter. My job remains the same either way." "And your place on the readiness roster?" Hale's eyes met Mason's directly, steady and uncompromising. "I'll take it, but I'll take it on my own terms." Mason allowed himself a faint smile, the expression of someone who had just confirmed his faith in his own judgment. "Fair enough. Just understand, if I ever have to speak those words again, it won't be in a training exercise." Hale nodded once, a silent understanding passing between them that transcended rank and protocol and reached into the realm of shared professional experience. The readiness roster appeared on the notice board the following morning, neatly typed on official letterhead, and pinned with the kind of ceremony that marked important announcements. Guards clustered around it in small groups, scanning the list for their names with the nervous energy of students awaiting exam results. When Fletcher, Trent and Dre finally reached the front of the crowd, their eyes found the middle section of the list and stopped moving entirely. Hale, Thomas, assigned, readiness rotation, category A, no additional remarks, no asterisks indicating special conditions, no explanatory footnotes. Just his name, printed in the same regulation typeface as everyone else who had earned a place on the elite roster. Fletcher stepped back from the board, his eyes automatically tracking down the corridor where Hale was walking past with his cap tucked under one arm, heading toward the kit room with the same measured pace he had maintained all week. There was no swagger in his stride, no hint of vindication or satisfaction. He could have walked straight past without acknowledging any of them, but instead he slowed fractionally as he approached. "Corporal," he said evenly, with the barest dip of his head that somehow managed to convey both respect for rank and complete professional composure. Fletcher cleared his throat, suddenly aware that the conversation he had been dreading was now unavoidable. "Hale, about yesterday, about the things we—" Hale raised a hand slightly, not dismissively, but with the quiet authority of someone ending a discussion before it could become uncomfortable for everyone involved. "It's done." His voice carried no trace of resentment or superiority, just the simple finality of someone who had moved past the week's events without carrying any grudges forward. And then he was gone, his boots tapping steadily down the polished corridor toward whatever duties awaited him next. By mid-afternoon, the courtyard outside Buckingham Palace was alive with its usual complement of tourists. The pale winter sunshine reflecting off the gleaming black and gold gates, while cameras clicked away at the timeless pageantry that never failed to draw crowds. The forecourt stones gleamed as though they had been polished that morning, and the air carried that particular London mixture of history and possibility that made even routine duties feel significant. Hale stood among the ceremonial guard in his full dress uniform. The tall black bearskin, perfectly positioned, red tunic immaculate despite the long hours of duty, rifle resting at exactly the regulation angle by his side. To the tourists gathered beyond the railings, he looked like any other guardsman, motionless, silent, eyes fixed on some distant point that seemed to exist beyond the immediate world of crowds and cameras. But Mason, making his regular rounds through the palace complex with a junior aide in tow, caught the details that others would miss entirely. The way Hale's breathing remained steady but alert, as though his body was prepared to move from stillness to action without a wasted heartbeat. How his gaze, though fixed straight ahead in the regulation manner, somehow took in everything happening at the edges of his vision, with the kind of peripheral awareness that came from experience in places where threats didn't announce themselves in advance. Mason didn't stop as he passed behind the ceremonial line. That would have drawn unwanted attention, violated the careful separation between the public performance and the private reality that made it possible. But as he walked past Hale's position, he allowed himself the faintest nod, not enough to be noticed by the watching tourists or the other guards, but sufficient to acknowledge what they both understood. For the briefest instant, Hale's eyes flickered in acknowledgement, a momentary connection that spoke of shared professional understanding. Then they settled back into the distant, unblinking stare that was part of his official duty, the face of a man whose job, once again, was to wait and watch and be ready for whatever might come next. Have you ever seen someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the exact moment they proved they were anything but? Do you think the commander was right to keep Hale's true abilities hidden until that final test? What would you have done in his position? If this story fascinated you, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss moments like this. Ring the notification bell to stay updated. Share this with anyone who understands that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look completely harmless. Our other stories are waiting on your screen. Click one now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another tale that proves the same truth. The most important battles are often won by those who know exactly when to show their true strength.